Hello, and welcome to the Dare County Extension Master Gardener's Home Gardening Presentation on Composting. My name is Gemma Green. I'm here with Chris Statter, and we are Dare County Extension Master Gardeners, which is part of North Carolina State Cooperative Extension Services. Today we will be discussing how the home gardener can create and maintain a compost pile. Chris, I'd like to get started today by asking, what is composting? It always sounds so scientific and difficult to me.
Well, composting can be defined as a method of breaking down organic materials into an end product that is beneficial to plants and soil. You know, over the past few years, there's been a lot of articles written about composting, Gemma, but even before there were people around, decomposition or composting was taking place in every field, forest, and swamp in the world. This modern procedure of composting is just kind of intensifying or speeding up a very, very natural process. Think of it as recycling your food waste and other organic materials.
Well, that is a more interesting way and actually simpler way of looking at composting. But why should I, as a home gardener, begin to compost?
Composting is beneficial to you, your home, your yard, and the environment.
The environment, how does it help the environment?
Well, did you know that food waste and yard debris comprise about 1/3 of the total solid waste generated by the United States? Well, when you compost, you're going to waste less garbage. Less garbage means less of a load on our landfill.
I did not know that. So let me ask you, how will it benefit me personally as a home gardener, my yard, my garden?
Composting improves the soil by slowly releasing back special nutrients like potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen, and other trace minerals slowly back into the soil. Eventually, you'll find you're using less fertilizer and buying less, and that means it saves money. Composting also provides a mulch, which helps in weed and erosion control, and also, when added to sandy soil, like we have here on the Outer Banks, it enhances water retention, as well as possibly hindering and slowing down some soil diseases.
Those are great benefits, but doesn't it take a lot of time and effort to compost?
Well, yes, it can. It depends how much effort you want to put into it. You have what some call slow or cold composting. And this is simply gathering leaves, plant trimmings, and other small yard debris, placing it into a 3x4 cubic foot area or a bin, sprinkling it with water, and letting it decay on its own.
Well, that certainly sounds easy enough.
Well, just remember that this method may take about a year before you can get any kind of compost that you can use.
So how would I speed up the process?
There is what is called fast composting or hot composting. And this is for gardeners who want their compost a little quicker. Now, this one takes some effort and time. It's using a combination of organic materials, moisture, and oxygen to provide an environment for microorganisms to break down the organic material and form compost.
Okay, so does it actually get hot?
The microorganisms, as they're feeding on the organic materials, do create heat.
How hot does it get? It's not going to catch on fire, is it?
No, it's not going to catch on fire. But the compost pile must reach over a temperature of 140 degrees Fahrenheit to be able to destroy a lot of the pathogens and weed seeds that are in the compost pile. If the compost pile doesn't heat up adequately, it could be because the pile is too small, that there's not enough oxygen, or that it is either way too wet or too dry.
Okay, so now I know what composting is. How do I know what I can compost?
The supply of compostable materials is almost unlimitless. It must have two characteristics, though. It first must be biodegradable, so you're not going to add, plastics or any other material that won't break down. The other thing, it needs to be safe for those poor little microorganisms in the compost pile. So you wouldn't add diseased plants or unsafe or toxic chemicals.
So can you give me some specific examples of what I can put in my compost pile?
Here is a list of some of the items that you can. These organic materials are categorized into two groups that offer favorable conditions of carbon and nitrogen for those microorganisms in the compost pile to thrive and survive.
Ooh, that's sounding very scientific to me. Is there an easier way to think of this?
Yes, there is. Think of it as browns and greens. This list gives you a short example of the two groups. The browns are sugar-rich carbon materials that provide energy and food for the microorganisms in the compost pile. It absorbs moisture and provides a good amount of support to the compost pile. The greens provide a protein-rich nitrogen and moisture to the compost pile, which the microorganisms need to help them break down the carbon materials. The greens help things get cooking in the compost pile.
Okay. Well, that is an easier way to think about it. I can certainly remember brown and green, and you mentioned cooking. So is there a recipe I can follow? I'm sure I just don't throw in as much green or brown materials that I feel like doing.
Well, out in the literature, there are a lot of recipes to create your compost pile. But a simple recipe is to use 2 parts brown to 1 part green. It's that easy. Some people may use an accelerator or starter to get things cooking in the pile, like manure or a balanced fertilizer, even a can of flat beer or non-diet soda. But these are not necessary if you're willing to turn the pile and maintain its moisture.
Okay, well, I think I can remember 2 parts brown to 1 part green, but I don't think my husband's going to give up his beer for my compost pile. So now I know what I can compost. I'm sure there are things that I shouldn't be adding to my compost pile. What are they?
This is a list of the things that you should not add to the compost pile. You have coal ashes and charcoal. They contain excessive amounts of sulfur and iron that are toxic to plants. Meat, bones, dairy products, they can cause some bad odors and attract pests. Diseased plants. The compost pile may not heat up hot enough to destroy the pathogens in those plants. Toxic plants. You wouldn't want to put poisonous plants such as poison ivy or oleander in your compost pile. Pet wastes. They can have dangerous organisms that might be harmful to human beings. And then you have branches and wood chunks. They're just way too large to break down in a simple compost pile.
What about something like eggshells?
Oh, eggshells are a great addition to the compost pile because they add calcium back into the soil. But you need to be sure that you crush them up really finely.
Okay, so let me ask you at this point, Chris, do you compost?
Yes, I do. I've composted now for about 10 years. I started out with a simple pile in the back corner of my yard, but that just wasn't working very well.
What happened?
Well, you know the constant wind we have down here on the Outer Banks, and those little critters helped redistribute the pile throughout my yard. That's when I decided to go to a simple bin using chicken wire and a metal rod, like these 2 examples here. And it kept my yard looking neat, it kept the pile in place, but I just wasn't seeing any kind of decomposition going on.
Why not?
Well, again, you learn. I found that I was only using browns in my compost pile. And I read that if I added kitchen waste, that would add the nitrogen to the compost pile as long as I buried it really deeply into and covered it with the brown material.
And did that work?
Well, it seemed to be working. I was starting to see some decomposition, but I had one problem. Where my home is situated, I have no shady area, and it is recommended that you put your compost pile into a shaded area, which will help retain the moisture and not let the pile heat up too much. Well, in order for my pile not to overheat and harm those microorganisms, I found out I had to turn it and water it on a daily basis.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work.
It really was. And then, of course, the little critters found my compost bin and made quite a mess. So I decided then to go to an enclosed composting structure.
A closed composting structure. What is that?
There are all kinds of compost structures and bins out in your big box stores, your gardening stores, and even hardware stores. And they are enclosed bins that are either spherical or tumbler type. For example, like these two pictured here. And the good thing about these is I found as I assembled my material, I could then put it into my compost pile. It kept those little critters away, and it kept my yard looking neat.
Well, they are neat looking structures. Are they expensive?
Well, they can be, but there are a lot of do-it-yourself compost structures and bins that you can create listed on the internet or in gardening books. But the big point is that you as a small home gardener need to find a system and a method that works well for you.
Okay, well now I've seen where some gardeners use like 2 or 3 structures that are sort of linked together. Is that some kind of special composting structure?
Oh, you're talking about the 3-chambered compost bin. This is a great structure for creating compost. The small home gardener is not going to use it very often though, because it takes up a lot of space, time, and money to build. It works on an assembly line principle. You have decomposition going on in 3 different stages. You start in the first chamber with all the new material, and in a few weeks, after keeping it moist and stirring it, you turn it into the second chamber, where it will continue to decompose. You're still maintaining moisture and turning it, and finally, after a few more weeks, you put it into the third chamber, where it will finish decomposition and cure for a while. The Arboretum and Teaching Garden has one of these structures, and the Dare Extension Master Gardeners use it to create mulch for their propagation purposes. Why don't we go and visit the Arboretum and see how the Master Gardeners create their compost? Hi, my name is Chris Stoddard. We're here at the Arboretum and Teaching Garden in Kill Devil Hills. I know many of you have toured the gardens and seen the great native flowers and plants that we have here. But today we're going behind the scenes to the compost demonstration area with John Phelan, who is a Dare Extension Master Gardener and part of the composting crew. John, tell us a little bit about this 3-chambered compost bin system.
Well, this is our new toy, and we've made it bigger and larger than our older one. It'll produce 2.4 cubic yards of mulch, and when you take them all together at the end of the year, we should be able to produce about 30 cubic yards of mulch.
Oh, wow, that's great. What do you use in this? What materials do you use to create the compost?
Well, we use the good old brown and green, and the brown is the majority of it, which is paper, grass clippings, old dead plants, and then what really makes this thing work is we've switched to coffee grinds for our nitrogen, our green substance.
Oh, is there a recipe you follow, or do you just throw it all in there?
We try to follow a recipe. It's about 70-30, 70 being the brown and the 30% being the green.
All right. What about stirring it and adding water?
Well, what we do is once a week, thanks to this nice little tool, we're able to turn the pile over very easily. And then
oh, very nice. What about, how do you know when the compost is ready to be used?
usually the color will tell. We can see that it's darker than the other product down there. And then the next thing is to pick it up and squeeze it, and if water doesn't come out, well, that tells us it's pretty much ready. And the third test is just to smell it, and if we can't smell the coffee grounds, well, then it's ready to go.
Wow. What about the screen? I see you have a screen over here. What do you use that for?
Well, we take the product when it's finished, we bring it over here, and we screen it. And so the good stuff goes down to the bottom here, and then we put the rest in the next bin. And we'll take that product over to our propagation area, which is right behind me.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much, John. This was a great demonstration.
So, Chris, now you've explained to me what I can and can't compost, and also given me a good idea of where I should put my composting materials in something like a composting structure. We've mentioned adding water and turning the pile. It still sounds like a lot of work to me.
Well, to create usable compost, there are 4 essential requirements.
And those requirements are?
Well, the first one we've already talked about, the carbon-nitrogen ratio in creating your compost pile, using that simple recipe of 2 parts of brown to 1 part green.
Okay, and the second one is?
Well, the second one is particle size. Decomposition starts on the surface of the organic materials. By chopping or shredding these materials, you create more of a surface area, and that actually accelerates the decomposition.
Okay, so for example, if I had a pile of leaves, I could run my lawnmower over it, and that would work?
Oh, that would be a great way of reducing the particle size.
Okay, what about things like large pieces of kitchen waste, like a watermelon rind or banana peels?
Well, those you would need to cut up into pieces about 2 inches in size.
Okay, well, that sounds easy enough. What's the third requirement?
The third requirement is moisture. Too much moisture or too little moisture, and you slow down the decomposition process. The literature recommends that a 40 to 60% moisture content is needed in the compost pile.
Well, now see, this sounds scientific again to me. How would I know as a home gardener if I had 40 to 60% moisture in my compost pile?
Well, an easy way of describing it is when you feel your compost, it feels like a well-wrung sponge. You pick up a handful of the compost, and if you squeeze it and 1 or 2 drops of water form, your pile is wet enough. If the pile is too wet, you may notice an unpleasant odor, and this is when you would add more carbons, because or the browns, because this will absorb the moisture, and then you will also turn the pile so that the moisture is redistributed. But I've noticed, especially down here in the heat that we get during the summer, that the compost piles are a little too dry. So that's when you're going to need to add moisture so that the composting process does not slow down.
Well, that is all great to know. So now we have this last requirement. What is that?
The 4th requirement is aeration, or turning the pile. Now, this is the hardest chore in creating compost. Those microorganisms need oxygen to survive. So you need to mix the compost, bringing the materials from the outside into the inside and stirring it up. And this actually helps accelerate the decomposition process.
Well, that's all great to know. Now, we've mentioned using kitchen scraps several times. How do you go about saving your kitchen scraps?
To save kitchen scraps, you can use a variety of containers. Like this one here, it's a stainless steel pail with a carbon filter in the lid to decrease some odors. This one is a ceramic composting pail. It has the charcoal in the lid to help decrease the odor also. But Gemma, any container with a wide mouth and a tight-fitting lid will work, such as an old ceramic cookie jar, a flour canister, or even a big one of the large coffee cans with a tight-fitting lid. Any of those will work. And you always have to, the other thing is you've got to keep it in a convenient place. Putting it on your counter or under the sink where it will remind you to collect the scraps until you have enough to add to your compost pile.
Yeah, but keeping it on your counter, won't it attract fruit flies?
Yeah. Yes, it can. That's why the carbon filters are in these pails and the tight-fitting lid. But you know, I've heard that some people, as they accumulate kitchen waste, they put it in either plastic containers or plastic bags and keep it in their refrigerator or freezer. And that keeps those fruit flies away.
Well, that is a good idea. I guess you just have to make sure you have room in your freezer or refrigerator for those kitchen scraps. Let me ask you this, though. How do I know when my compost is ready?
Your compost, I have a little sample here for you, Gemma. Compost is ready when it's even in color and texture, where you don't recognize any of the material that you initially added to the compost pile. It has a sweet, earthy smell, and there's no off or offensive odors. Another way is the temperature of the compost. When you touch your compost pile and the temperature is the same as the outdoor temperature, you know those microorganisms have finished doing their job. And then there is the third way, which is putting a little bit of the compost in a plastic bag and sealing it. If after about an hour you don't see any condensation of moisture in the bag, then your compost is probably ready.
How long will that take?
Well, it depends on how much time and effort you put into it. It can take anywhere from 2 to 12 months.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for sharing all this great information on composting. Now today we've covered the basics of composting, those 4 essential requirements such as the green to brown ratio, the particle size, the moisture level, and turning or aerating your pile. But if I wanted to learn more about composting, where could I get that information?
If you have access to the internet, you could go to the North Carolina Cooperative Extension website and download this pamphlet on composting. It's easy to find. But otherwise, you can call the Dare County Extension Cooperative Extension at 473-4290 and ask them for a copy of the publication on composting, and they'll send it to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.